Some bullets find their target, but the ones that miss can change everything. The mist clung to the Cordillera Oriental like a shroud that October morning, thick enough to swallow screams whole. Miguel Vargas pressed his face against the wet stone, watching Escobar's convoy snake through the mountain pass below. 3 armored trucks carrying what his sources promised was the largest cocaine shipment of the year. What they hadn't mentioned were the wooden crates marked with symbols that made his grandmother's rosary feel heavy in his pocket. The ambush lasted exactly 4 minutes. When the gunfire stopped and the fog began to clear, Miguel stood among 7 dead men, including his own crew. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The dying sicario at his feet whispered a name Miguel hadn't heard in 5 years, Agent Ramirez, his real name, his buried name. That's when he heard them, voices drifting from the shattered crates like smoke, voices of the dead, voices that knew exactly who Miguel Vargas really was and why he'd betrayed his own government to survive in Escobar's world. The artifacts scattered across the bloody asphalt weren't just ancient relics. They were something else entirely. What happens when a man's past refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miguel's hands trembled as he crouched beside the dying sicario, the man's blood pooling around the strange golden figurine that had spilled from the nearest crate. The whispered name, Agent Ramirez, hung in the thin mountain air like an accusation. 5 years. 5 years since he'd buried that identity beneath layers of violence and necessity, transforming from a DEA informant into El Sombra, the shadow who executed problems for the Medellin cartel. The dying man's eyes were already glassing over, but his lips moved again. Ramirez, they know, they've always known. Miguel pressed the barrel of his Beretta against the sicario's temple. One squeeze would silence him forever, but the man's breathing hitched and stopped before Miguel could decide. The mountain reclaimed its silence, broken only by the settling groans of twisted metal and the distant hiss of radiator steam. He should have been moving. Should have been searching the trucks for the cocaine, loading what he could carry, and disappearing into the maze of mountain trails he knew better than any road map. His wife Carmen was waiting in their cramped apartment in Barrio Popular, rationing the last of their rice, their 2 children asking questions about dinner that had no good answers. This ambush was supposed to change everything, enough product to sell that would buy them passage to Ecuador, maybe Venezuela. Somewhere Pablo's reach couldn't follow. Instead, Miguel found himself staring at the artifacts scattered across the asphalt like pieces of a broken puzzle. The golden figurine near his feet depicted a warrior with hollow eyes and an open mouth, as if caught mid-scream. Beside it lay obsidian blades, ceramic vessels painted with symbols that seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision, and carved jade masks whose expressions shifted when he wasn't looking directly at them. The voices came again. Not from the dying sicario this time, but from the artifacts themselves, whispers in Spanish, in English, in languages he didn't recognize. But underneath them all, threading through like smoke through a crowded room, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Miguel, Miguel, why did you let us die? His grandmother's voice, Rosa Vargas, who'd raised him in the hills outside Bogotá after his parents disappeared during La Violencia. She died 2 years ago while he was deep undercover, and he'd never made it to her funeral, never said goodbye, never told her he'd become exactly the kind of man she'd prayed he'd never be. You promised to be good, mijo. You promised. Miguel scrambled backward, his boots slipping on blood and broken glass. The voices multiplied, not just his grandmother now, but others. Cartel members he'd executed to prove his loyalty. Innocent bystanders caught in crossfire, the federal judge whose family Miguel had watched die to maintain his cover. Each voice carried the weight of specific memory, specific betrayal. We trusted you, whispered Lieutenant Torres, Miguel's former DEA partner, the man who'd bled out in Miguel's arms after their safe house was compromised. We thought you were one of the good ones. The fog was lifting from the valley below, and Miguel could hear engines in the distance. Backup convoy, probably. Or worse, Escobar's cleanup crew, sent to investigate when the primary shipment failed to reach its destination. Either way, he had minutes at most before this mountain pass became his grave. But he couldn't move, couldn't look away from the artifacts that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The golden figurine's eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were looking at him, seeing through him, cataloging every sin he'd committed in the name of survival. Agent Miguel Ramirez, the voices chorused now, speaking in unison. Badge number 77,394. Born in Zipaquira. Recruited by the DEA at age 26. Turned informant at 28. Turned killer at 35. Stop, Miguel whispered, pressing his palms against his ears. But the voices weren't coming through his ears. They were inside his skull, burrowing into memories he'd spent years trying to forget. You can't run from what you are. You can't hide from what you've done. We've been waiting for you, Miguel. We've been waiting so very long. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Miguel forced himself to stand, forced his legs to carry him toward his motorcycle hidden in the tree line. But as he moved, he felt something shift in the air around him, as if the mountain itself was waking up. The artifact's whispers followed him, growing stronger rather than weaker with distance. He'd come here for cocaine and found something infinitely more dangerous, something that knew his real name, knew his real history. Something that Pablo Escobar had been transporting through these mountains for reasons that had nothing to do with drug trafficking. As Miguel reached his bike, hands shaking too badly to insert the key on his first attempt, he realized the truth that would haunt him down the mountain and into whatever came next. This hadn't been an ambush at all. It had been a summoning. The motorcycle's engine coughed to life on his third attempt, the familiar growl cutting through the supernatural whispers that still echoed in his skull. Miguel gunned it down the serpentine mountain road, taking curves at speeds that would have been suicidal in daylight, but the pre-dawn darkness was his ally now. It always had been. El Sombra, the shadow, moved best when the world couldn't see him coming. The voices faded as he put distance between himself and the artifacts, but they didn't disappear entirely. They settled into the back of his mind like sediment, waiting. The golden figurine's hollow eyes had burned themselves into his memory, and he could swear he still felt their weight watching him even as he descended into Medellin's sprawling valley. By the time he reached the city's outskirts, the sun was painting the eastern peaks in shades of rust and gold. Miguel ditched the motorcycle in an abandoned lot 6 blocks from his apartment, standard protocol after any operation. He walked the remaining distance, forcing his breathing to steady, his hands to stop shaking. Carmen would be awake soon, if she wasn't already. She always seemed to know when he'd been out on business, even though he'd never told her exactly what that business entailed. The building where they lived squatted like a concrete tumor against the hillside, its walls stained with decades of rain and neglect. Miguel climbed 3 flights of stairs, stepping carefully over the broken step on the second landing. Mrs. Delgado's radio was already playing Vallenatos through her thin door. The smell of brewing coffee drifted from the Martinez apartment. Normal sounds, normal smells, the mundane rhythms of a world that had no idea what horrors moved through its shadows. Miguel's key turned silently in their lock, a skill learned from necessity, refined by practice. The apartment's main room was barely large enough for their salvaged furniture. A couch that sagged in the middle, a wooden table with one leg shorter than the others, a small television that only received 2 channels clearly. But it was clean. Carmen made sure of that, no matter how little money they had. She was standing at the kitchenette's single window, still in her nightgown, watching the city wake up below them. At 41, she retained the quiet beauty that had first caught his attention 7 years ago, though worry lines had deepened around her eyes. Lines he'd put there. "Any trouble?" she asked without turning around. "No," Miguel lied, the word coming as naturally as breathing. "Simple pickup run. Nothing complicated." Carmen's reflection in the window showed the slight tightening around her mouth that meant she knew he wasn't telling her everything. She never pushed, though. That was their unspoken agreement. He provided for the family through whatever means necessary, and she didn't ask questions that might force him to lie more elaborately. "Elena needs new school shoes," she said, still looking out the window. "The soles on her old ones have worn through completely, and Javier's been asking about soccer cleats again. The other boys..." I'll handle it, Miguel said, though the artifact's whispers seemed to mock him even as he made the promise. The cocaine he'd come for was still scattered across that mountain road, probably being loaded into Escobar's cleanup vehicles right now, which meant no payday, which meant another week of rationed meals and disappointed children. Papa? Elena's voice came from the bedroom doorway, small and sleep-rough. At 8 years old, she was all dark eyes and tangled hair, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better decades. Did you bring anything? The question hit him like a physical blow. Not because she was asking for presents, though that was painful enough, but because of the careful hope in her voice. The same tone she'd used 3 weeks ago when he'd promised her new shoes. The same tone from a month before that when Javier had asked about the soccer cleats. Not this time, Princesa, Miguel said, crouching down to her level. But soon, okay? Papa's working on something big. Elena nodded with the solemn acceptance of a child who'd learned not to expect too much. She padded back to the bedroom she shared with her 10-year-old brother, and Miguel felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with supernatural artifacts or ancient curses. Carmen finally turned from the window, and he saw his own exhaustion reflected in her face. The rent's due Friday, she said quietly. I know. And the electrical bill. I know. She studied his face for a long moment, taking in details he couldn't hide from someone who'd known him this long. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes couldn't quite meet hers, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of violence recently committed. Miguel, she said, and for a terrifying moment he thought the voices had followed him home, that the artifacts had somehow infected her with knowledge of his true identity. Whatever happened tonight, whatever you're not telling me, just promise me you'll be careful. We need you. They need you. The weight of that truth settled over him like a shroud. Carmen was right. They did need him. Not Miguel Ramirez, the idealistic DEA agent who believed in justice and redemption. They needed El Sombra, the killer who could provide for them in a world where honest work paid starvation wages and asking questions got you buried in unmarked graves. But as Carmen moved past him toward the kitchen to start breakfast, Miguel caught a glimpse of his reflection in their cracked mirror. For just a moment, superimposed over his weathered features, he saw the golden figurine's hollow eyes staring back at him. The artifacts were still calling his name. Miguel stared at his reflection until the golden eyes faded, leaving only his own haunted gaze staring back. He turned away from the mirror and moved toward the kitchen, where Carmen was measuring coffee with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how much they could afford to waste, which was none. The morning routine should have been comforting. The sound of water heating in their dented pot, the smell of cheap coffee mixing with the faint scent of Carmen's soap, Elena emerging from the bedroom with her hair braided, her school uniform clean but clearly outgrown, Javier following behind, trying to smooth down the cowlick that made him look younger than his 10 years. But the whispers hadn't left him entirely. They lurked at the edges of his consciousness, waiting. And worse, Miguel found himself listening for them. Part of him needed to know what else those artifacts might reveal, what other secrets they might expose. The knock at the door came as they were sitting down to breakfast. Weak coffee and yesterday's bread, toasted to hide how stale it had become. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, professional. Miguel's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol tucked beneath his shirt, but he caught himself before Elena or Javier noticed. Carmen's fork paused halfway to her mouth, her eyes finding his across the small table. Probably Mrs. Delgado, Miguel said quietly, though they both knew their neighbor's arthritis meant she knocked soft and long, not sharp and measured. Children, Carmen said, her voice artificially bright. Why don't you finish getting ready for school in the bedroom? Elena started to protest, but something in her mother's tone made her gather her brother without argument. The bedroom door clicked shut behind them. Miguel rose and approached the door carefully, noting that whoever stood outside was positioned to avoid the peephole's view. Another professional touch that made his pulse quicken. Miguel Ramirez? The voice was cultured, with the careful neutrality of someone educated enough to shed regional accents. We need to talk. The name hit him like ice water. Not El Sombra. Not even Miguel Vargas, the identity he'd used for the past 5 years. Miguel Ramirez, the DEA agent who was supposed to be dead. You have the wrong apartment, Miguel called back, his free hand settling on his weapon's grip. I don't think so, Agent. My employer knows exactly who lives here. He knows about your wife Carmen, your daughter Elena, your son Javier. He knows Elena needs new shoes and that you failed to acquire the funding for them last night. The specificity of the knowledge was designed to terrify, and it worked. Miguel's throat went dry. What do you want? To make you an offer. One that could solve your immediate financial problems. I'm not interested. A soft chuckle drifted through the door. You haven't heard the offer yet. And frankly, given your current circumstances, I think you'll find it quite compelling. Miguel glanced back at Carmen, who was gripping her coffee cup with white knuckles. Her eyes held a question he couldn't answer because he didn't understand what was happening himself. Less than 4 hours ago, he'd been El Sombra, unknown and anonymous. Now someone was using his real name, demonstrating knowledge of his family, his failures. Who sent you? Miguel asked. Someone who was very interested in what you discovered on that mountain road. Someone who understands that certain artifacts have a way of calling to specific people. You heard voices, didn't you, Agent Ramirez? Voices from your past? Miguel's blood turned to ice. There was no way this stranger could know about the whispers unless he'd been there. Unless this was all connected to whatever Escobar had been transporting. 30 seconds, the voice continued. Then I leave, and you can explain to your family why the electricity gets cut off tomorrow and why you'll be homeless by the weekend. Or you can open the door and learn about an opportunity that could change everything. Miguel looked at Carmen again, saw the fear in her eyes mixing with something else. Hope. Desperate, dangerous hope that maybe this was the break they'd been praying for. Elena's voice drifted from the bedroom, asking Javier if he thought Papa would really get them new shoes this time. The weight of their need pressed against Miguel's chest like a physical force. El Sombra was compromised, had maybe been compromised all along if people knew his real identity. But Miguel Ramirez had been a good agent once, had believed in justice, in protecting the innocent. Maybe this was chance to be that man again, even if it meant walking into whatever trap was waiting on the other side of the door. The artifact's whispers stirred in his memory, and for just a moment, he heard his grandmother's voice again. You promised to be good, mijo. Miguel made his choice. He unlocked the door. The door swung open to reveal a man who looked more like a university professor than anyone Miguel had expected. Mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a simple gray suit that had seen better years but was meticulously maintained. He carried a leather satchel and smiled with the patient warmth of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened people. Thank you, the man said, stepping inside without invitation. I'm Dr. Alejandro Restrepo. May I sit? Miguel's hand remained on his weapon as he closed the door. Start talking. Carmen stood behind her husband, close enough to run if needed, far enough to avoid immediate danger. Her presence anchored Miguel even as every instinct screamed that this was a trap. Dr. Restrepo settled into their sagging couch as if he visited desperate families in tenement apartments every morning. What you encountered last night wasn't random, Agent Ramirez. Those artifacts have been calling to specific individuals for months, people with particular backgrounds, particular guilt. You're working with Escobar, Miguel said. It wasn't a question. God, no. Restrepo's reaction seemed genuine, though Pablo certainly thought he could control what he'd acquired. He was wrong, of course. The pre-Columbian pieces he'd been collecting aren't just archaeological treasures, they're conduits, windows into trauma that refuses to stay buried. Miguel felt the whispers stirring again at the mention of the artifacts, his grandmother's voice threading through his consciousness like smoke. What do you want? Pablo's dead, as of 3 hours ago, killed on a rooftop in Barrio Los Olivos by the search block. Restrepo paused, studying Miguel's reaction, but his collection remains, scattered across safe houses throughout the city. And it's awakening things. People are hearing voices, seeing things that shouldn't be possible. The authorities are calling it mass hysteria, but we know better. Carmen's sharp intake of breath made Miguel glance back. Her face had gone pale. The radio this morning, she whispered. They said 3 families in La Macarena threw themselves from their balconies last night, all of them screaming about voices. Precisely. Restrepo opened his satchel and withdrew a photograph, the golden figurine Miguel had seen on the mountain road. Even in the image, its hollow eyes seemed to follow him. The artifacts are responding to guilt, Agent. They're finding people who've done terrible things and forcing them to confront their victims. The families who died, they were all connected to the cartel in some way. Miguel's mouth went dry. You're saying these things are killing people? I'm saying they're revealing truth. Whether someone can survive that revelation depends on their capacity to bear the weight of what they've done. Restrepo's eyes found Miguel's through his glasses. You survived your encounter because you're stronger than most, or perhaps because your guilt serves a purpose beyond self-destruction. The bedroom door creaked, and Elena's small voice called out, "Mama, is Papa in trouble?" The innocence in that question hit Miguel like a physical blow. His children had no idea what their father had become, what names echoed in his dreams, what blood stained his hands. They only knew he sometimes brought home money and always tried to protect them. Your family, Restrepo continued quietly, they anchor you, give you something to fight for beyond mere survival. That's rare among the men I've been approaching. Approaching for what? To retrieve the artifacts before they kill everyone they touch. Pablo scattered them across the city when he realized he couldn't control them. Each piece is now calling to people like you, former agents, cartel members, anyone whose life is built on necessary sins. My employer wants them collected before the body count climbs higher. Miguel's grandmother's voice whispered through his thoughts, "You promised to be good, mijo." But what was good anymore? Letting innocent families die because he was too afraid to act? Or walking into another trap because his children needed shoes? Who's your employer? He asked. Someone who understands that some evils are necessary to prevent greater ones. Someone willing to pay 50,000 American dollars for each artifact recovered. Carmen's gasp was audible. That much money could move them anywhere. Ecuador, Venezuela, maybe even the United States. It could buy Elena her shoes and Javier his cleats, and all of them a chance at something resembling a normal life. But Miguel had learned to recognize bait, no matter how attractive. What's the catch? The artifacts will fight back. They'll show you things, make you relive your worst memories, force you to confront everyone you've wronged. Restrepo's expression grew serious. Some men break completely. Others find a kind of peace in finally facing the truth. Miguel looked at Carmen, saw the desperate hope warring with terror in her eyes. His children were asking quiet questions in the next room, trying to understand if this stranger meant safety or danger. And underneath it all, the whispers continued, calling his name, promising answers he wasn't sure he was strong enough to hear. Miguel closed his eyes and felt the weight of 5 years pressing against his chest, 5 years of being someone else, of pretending the man he'd been was dead and buried. When he opened them again, Carmen was watching him with an expression he recognized, the same look she'd given him the night he'd first confessed he wasn't who the cartel thought he was, when he'd whispered his real name in the darkness of their bed and waited for her to run. She hadn't run then. She wasn't running now. "When do we start?" Miguel asked. Restrepo's smile was thin but approving. "Tonight. The first artifact is in a safe house in Comuna 13. The family guarding it started hearing voices yesterday. Their teenage son has been screaming about dead children since dawn." Miguel felt something shift inside him, a door closing on one life and opening to another. El Sombra had been a mask, a necessary fiction that let him survive in a world where survival meant becoming a monster. But Miguel Ramirez had been someone who protected people, someone who'd sworn an oath to serve justice, even if justice in Colombia was a luxury few could afford. "I'll need weapons," he said. "And backup." "No backup. The artifacts respond to individuals, not groups, and the weapons you'll need aren't the kind made of steel and gunpowder." Restrepo reached into his satchel again and withdrew what looked like a small leather pouch, salt from the Caribbean, blessed by a priest in Cartagena. The indigenous shamans say it helps ground you when the voices get too strong. Carmen stepped forward, her hand finding Miguel's shoulder. "What about us? If people know who you really are?" "You'll be protected," Restrepo said. "My employer has resources, safe transport out of the city, new identities, enough money to disappear completely." He paused, studying Miguel's face. "But only if the job gets finished, all the artifacts recovered. There are 7 pieces total. 7 chances to lose his mind. 7 opportunities for the whispers to drag him so deep into his own guilt that he never found his way back to the surface. Miguel thought of the families who'd thrown themselves from balconies, wondered what voices they'd been hearing in those final moments. But then Elena's voice drifted from the bedroom again, asking Javier if they'd have breakfast tomorrow, and Miguel felt his resolve crystallize into something harder than diamond. "The safe house," he said. "Give me the address." Restrepo wrote it on a piece of paper with handwriting that belonged to someone accustomed to academic precision. "The family's name is Morales. Father, mother, 3 children. They've been loyal to Pablo for 8 years, but loyalty doesn't protect them from what they're guarding now." He stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "Agent Ramirez, I want you to understand something. The man who walks into that house tonight won't be the same one who walks out. The artifacts don't just reveal truth, they change you, force you to reconcile with who you've been so you can become who you need to be." Miguel took the paper, his fingers steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. "And if I can't handle what they show me? Then your family joins the families on those balconies. The guilt spreads like infection, through proximity, through love, through any connection strong enough to carry the weight of truth." Restrepo's eyes found Carmen's. "That's why this can't wait. Every hour those artifacts remain active, more people die." The bedroom door opened, and Elena emerged, school bag clutched in her small hands. She looked between the adults with the careful alertness of a child who'd learned to read danger in grown-up conversations. "Papa?" she said quietly. "Are you going away again?" Miguel knelt down and pulled her close, breathing in the soap and sleep smell of her hair. Behind her, Javier appeared in the doorway, trying to look brave but failing to hide the worry in his young eyes. "Just for a little while, Princesa," Miguel said, his voice steady despite the breaking happening inside him. "But when I come back, we're going to go somewhere new, somewhere better. Somewhere with good schools?" Elena asked. "The best schools, with new shoes and soccer cleats and anything else you want." He was making promises he might not live to keep, but the hope that bloomed in his children's faces made the risk feel like something approaching righteousness. Miguel Ramirez, the DEA agent, had failed to protect Colombia from men like Escobar. El Sombra, the killer, had failed to provide for his family through violence. Maybe Miguel Vargas, some new amalgamation of guilt and purpose, could find redemption in saving strangers from supernatural judgment. The whispers stirred as Restrepo left, as Miguel kissed his family goodbye, as he checked his weapons and prepared to walk into darkness that might claim his sanity. But for the first time in 5 years, the voices calling his name didn't sound like condemnation. They sounded like invitation. The afternoon heat pressed down on Medellin like a suffocating blanket as Miguel made his way through the winding streets of Comuna 13. The neighborhood bore fresh scars from military operations. Bullet holes in concrete walls, spray-painted warnings that changed weekly depending on which faction currently held territory. Miguel moved through the maze of narrow alleys with the practiced invisibility of a man who'd spent 5 years learning to be no one at all. But the whispers followed him. They'd started soft, barely audible beneath the sounds of cumbia music spilling from open doorways and children playing soccer in dusty lots. His grandmother's voice, threading through his consciousness like smoke, "Mijo, the dead don't rest easy when justice sleeps." By the time he reached the safe house, a modest 2-story building with barred windows and faded yellow paint, the voices had multiplied. Not just his grandmother now, but others, faceless victims from his DEA days, informants who'd trusted him with their lives only to disappear into cartel dungeons. The weight of their accusations pressed against his skull like gathering storm clouds. The screaming from inside the house was audible from 2 blocks away. Miguel paused at the corner, studying the building through practiced eyes. No lookouts posted, no defensive positions manned. Either the Morales family was too lost in their supernatural torment to maintain security, or this was an elaborate trap designed to draw him into the open. The pouch of blessed salt felt warm against his chest where he'd tucked it beneath his shirt, next to the photograph of Elena and Javier he always carried. Restrepo had promised it would help ground him when the artifact's influence became overwhelming, but Miguel wondered if any earthly protection could shield him from the accumulated weight of his sins. A child's scream pierced the air, high and desperate and full of terror no 10-year-old should ever experience. Miguel's feet were moving before his mind finished processing the sound muscle memory from his DEA days overriding 5 years of self-preservation instincts. The front door hung open, swaying gently in the humid breeze. Miguel drew his pistol and stepped inside, immediately hit by the metallic taste of fear sweat and something else, an electric charge that made his skin crawl, as if the air itself was alive with malevolent energy. "Please," a woman's voice sobbed from somewhere upstairs. "Please make it stop, he's just a baby." Miguel climbed the stairs 2 at a time, following the sound of anguish to a small bedroom where he found them. Eduardo Morales pressed against the far wall, his wife Rosa clutching their youngest daughter while their teenage son Carlos writhed on the bed, his eyes rolled back white, his mouth moving in a constant stream of whispered names. And there, on the nightstand next to the boy's thrashing form, sat the artifact. It was smaller than the golden figurine from the Convoy, a jade mask carved with intricate spirals that seemed to shift and move when viewed peripherally. But Miguel felt its power immediately, a psychic pressure that drove spikes of memory through his consciousness. Suddenly he was back in a Bogota warehouse, watching a man he'd recruited as an informant take a bullet meant for him. The man's wife had cursed Miguel as her husband bled out, promised that his betrayals would follow him to the grave. "You promised to protect him," her voice whispered now, threading through the artifact's influence. "You promised he'd be safe." "Who are you?" Eduardo Morales demanded, though his voice shook with exhaustion. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and Miguel could see the man hadn't slept in days. "Someone who can help," Miguel said, forcing himself to focus on the present. "How long has your son been like this?" 3 days, Rosa sobbed. "Ever since we brought that thing home. He keeps talking about children, names we don't recognize. Says they're calling to him, telling him what they did before they died." Miguel approached the bed carefully, fighting against the artifact's psychic pull. The boy, Carlos, couldn't have been more than 16, but his face was gaunt with suffering. His whispered litany of names included some Miguel recognized, victims of cartel violence, children caught in crossfire, innocents whose deaths had been written off as collateral damage in the war against drugs. "They want justice," Carlos gasped, his eyes suddenly focusing on Miguel with unnatural clarity. "The dead children. They want someone to remember their names, to make it stop." Miguel reached for the jade mask, and the moment his fingers made contact, the whispers exploded into a full symphony of accusation. Every person he'd failed to save, every compromise he'd made in service of what he'd told himself was the greater good. The weight of their collective judgment threatened to drive him to his knees. But then he heard Elena's voice, cutting through the supernatural cacophony. "Papa, are you going away again?" His living daughter's fear anchored him to the present, gave him strength to withstand the dead children's righteous anger. Miguel closed his fingers around the artifact and felt its power surge through him, not destroying him, but revealing him, showing him exactly who he'd been, who he'd become, and who he might yet choose to be. When he lifted the mask from the nightstand, Carlos's thrashing stopped immediately. The boy's breathing deepened into natural sleep, and the oppressive atmosphere in the room lifted like morning fog burning away beneath sunlight. 7 artifacts total, 6 more chances to confront the weight of necessary sins. Miguel tucked the jade mask into his jacket and headed for the door, already hearing new whispers calling him toward the next test. The descent from Comuna 13 felt like emerging from an underwater cave, each step away from the Morales house allowing Miguel to breathe a little easier, though the jade mask pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The whispers had quieted but not disappeared entirely. They hummed beneath his consciousness now, a constant reminder that he carried the accumulated grief of murdered children in his jacket pocket. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette, the flame wavering in the humid evening air. 1 artifact down, 6 to go, each one promising to strip away another layer of the carefully constructed fiction that was El Sombra, forcing Miguel Ramirez to stare into mirrors he'd spent 5 years avoiding. The second address Restrepo had given him led to Barrio Manrique, deeper into cartel territory where even the police feared to venture after dark. Miguel checked his watch. 8:47 p.m. Carmen would be reading bedtime stories to Elena right now, her voice soft and steady as she painted pictures of princesses who never had to worry about their fathers disappearing into the night. The thought of his daughter's trust felt simultaneously like salvation and condemnation. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. News travels fast in our circles. Heard you paid the Morales family a visit. Impressive work. Next location has complications. Call when you're in position. R. Complications. Miguel had learned to translate academic euphemisms during his DEA years. Complications meant armed resistance or civilian casualties, or both. It meant the difference between a surgical extraction and a massacre, between coming home to his family and adding his own name to the growing list of voices crying for justice. The bus ride to Manrique took 40 minutes through streets that grew progressively darker as legitimate businesses gave way to bars with bulletproof windows and corner stores that served as fronts for money laundering. Miguel studied his reflection in the grimy window, El Sombra staring back at him, but with Miguel Ramirez's eyes beginning to show through the mask. His grandmother's voice stirred. The dead don't want revenge, mijo. They want remembrance. Easy for you to say, abuela, he whispered to the glass. You never had to carry a gun to remember anyone. But even as he spoke the words, Miguel felt their hollowness. His grandmother had buried 3 sons to cartel violence, had spent the last years of her life lighting candles for boys who would never come home. She'd carried her own weight of necessary sins, the lies she'd told to keep her remaining family safe, the bribes she'd paid to corrupt cops, the names she'd never dared speak aloud. Maybe that's what the artifacts really did. Not punishment, but recognition. A supernatural accounting that forced people to see their choices not as isolated acts of survival, but as threads in a vast web of cause and consequence. The bus stopped 3 blocks from his destination. Miguel walked the remaining distance through streets where salsa music masked the sound of automatic weapons being loaded, where children played games that mimicked cartel executions, where every doorway could hide either sanctuary or slaughter. The safe house was a 3-story concrete building, wedged between a motorcycle repair shop and a storefront church. No lights showed in the upper windows, but Miguel could see the telltale flicker of candles through gaps in makeshift curtains. More concerning were the 2 men smoking cigarettes on the opposite corner, too well dressed for the neighborhood, too alert for casual loiterers, watchers. The question was whether they worked for Restrepo's mysterious employer, for rival cartels looking to claim the artifacts, or for some third faction Miguel hadn't yet identified. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Complications, Restrepo's voice said without preamble. The Herrera family has been compromised. Their eldest son started talking, told his friends about voices, about seeing dead people. Word reached some very interested ears. How interested? The kind that come with sniper rifles and orders to eliminate witnesses. My intelligence suggests you have perhaps 20 minutes before the area becomes decidedly unhospitable. Miguel studied the building again, noting the lack of escape routes, the elevated positions that would give shooters clear lines of fire. And the family? Still inside, still guarding the artifact, a silver amulet that apparently shows people how their victims died. The mother hasn't spoken in 2 days, just rocks back and forth, crying. 20 minutes to infiltrate a building, extract a supernatural artifact from a traumatized family, and escape before professional killers turn the entire block into a war zone. Miguel touched the blessed salt pouch beneath his shirt, drew strength from the photograph of his children pressed against his heart. Any backup coming? You're the backup, Agent. Everyone else who's attempted retrieval has either gone insane or disappeared entirely. Restrepo paused. The artifact in that building has been active longer than the others. Its influence may be more intense. Miguel ended the call and checked his weapons one final time. The jade mask seemed to pulse against his ribs, and for a moment he could swear he heard Carlos Morales whispering his name, not in accusation, but in gratitude. 6 more artifacts. 6 more families torn apart by supernatural judgment. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, the ghosts of murdered children waited to see if Miguel Vargas had the strength to carry their pain without breaking beneath its weight. Miguel crossed the street with the measured pace of a man walking to his own execution. The two watchers on the corner tracked his movement without apparent recognition, but their hands drifted closer to concealed weapons. Professional killers who sensed predator in his approach, even if they couldn't identify the specific threat. The jade mask pulsed against his ribs like a second heart, and with each beat, the whispers grew stronger. Not just his grandmother now, or the DEA informants he'd failed to protect. New voices joined the chorus. Every child who died while he played God with intelligence files. Every innocent who'd taken a bullet meant for the monsters he'd been hunting. Miguel Ramirez, they whispered in unison. We remember you. His real name, the name that would get him tortured to death if the wrong people heard it, spoken by the ghosts of everyone he'd sworn to protect. Miguel touched the blessed salt beneath his shirt, but the sacred charm felt cold against his palm, inadequate protection against the supernatural reckoning gathering around him like storm clouds. 18 minutes until professional killers transformed this block into a cemetery. The building's front door stood slightly ajar, candlelight flickering through the gap. Miguel drew his pistol and stepped inside, immediately overwhelmed by the psychic pressure radiating from somewhere above. This artifact was older than the jade mask, its influence deeper and more malevolent. The air itself felt thick with accumulated anguish. A woman's sobbing echoed from the second floor, raw, broken sounds that spoke of a mind pushed beyond its breaking point. Miguel climbed the stairs, his footsteps lost beneath the weight of supernatural judgment pressing down like tons of water above a drowning man. He found them in what had once been a living room. The Herrera family clustered around a coffee table where a silver amulet lay gleaming in the candlelight. The artifact was beautiful in the way a serpent is beautiful. Intricate engravings that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly, promising truth too terrible for mortal comprehension. The mother, Isabella, rocked back and forth in her chair, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at something only she could see. Her husband Diego pressed his back against the far wall, eyes wide with terror, while their teenage daughter Maria clutched a kitchen knife with white knuckles. But it was the son, the one who'd been talking to his friends, who commanded Miguel's attention. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor beside the amulet, his young face aged by suffering, his voice a steady monotone as he recited names and dates and methods of execution. Elena Vasquez, age 9, found in the Magdalena River with her throat cut. Carlos Mendez, age 11, disappeared walking home from school, body never found. Sofia Restrepo, age 7, Miguel's blood turned to ice. Restrepo, the academic who'd recruited him, who claimed to work for mysterious employers with unlimited resources. Was it coincidence, or was this supernatural judgment revealing connections that ran deeper than Miguel had imagined? Hung from a bridge in Belo as a message to her father. They all want to know why, senor. They all want to know why nobody came to save them. The boy's eyes found Miguel's, and in that gaze was recognition that transcended normal human perception. This child had been touched by forces beyond mortal understanding, transformed into a conduit for the collective rage of the murdered innocent. You know some of their names, the boy said. You had files on their killers, intelligence reports that could have prevented their deaths, if anyone had cared enough to act on them. Miguel approached the amulet, fighting against psychic pressure that threatened to crush his skull. Every step forward brought new waves of memory. Briefings where children's deaths were classified as acceptable losses, operations canceled because the political cost outweighed the humanitarian benefit. Moments when Miguel Ramirez, the federal agent, had chosen strategic necessity over moral clarity. His grandmother's voice cut through the supernatural cacophony. The dead don't want revenge, mijo. They want remembrance. But these weren't just any dead. These were the children whose murders he could have prevented, whose killers he'd allowed to escape because saving them would have compromised larger operations. The weight of their accusation was precise and terrible. Not that he'd killed them directly, but that he'd chosen other priorities while they suffered and died. 15 minutes, his phone buzzed with a text from Restrepo. Extraction team in position. Miguel reached for the silver amulet, knowing that touching it would force him to confront the full weight of every compromise he'd made in service of the greater good. Every child sacrifice offered on the altar of strategic thinking. Every innocent death he'd filed away as regrettable but necessary. When his fingers closed around the artifact, the world exploded into truth. He saw them all. Every murdered child whose death could have been prevented if Agent Miguel Ramirez had possessed the courage to act on incomplete intelligence, to risk operational security for the sake of individual lives. Their faces filled his vision, their voices became his voice, their pain became the foundation upon which any redemption would have to be built. Outside, automatic weapons fire erupted as professional killers moved into position. Miguel Vargas, no longer fully Ramirez, not quite El Sombra, stood at the center of supernatural judgment and prepared to discover whether some sins could only be absolved through blood. The silver amulet's surface erupted with visions the moment Miguel's fingers touched the metal. Every child whose file he'd marked non-priority appeared before him in perfect, terrible detail, not as crime scene photographs or intelligence reports, but as living, breathing accusations. Their wounds were fresh, their terror immediate, their deaths playing out in slow motion while Miguel watched helplessly. "You knew where Martinez kept us," whispered Elena Vasquez, her throat gaping. 2 weeks you watched his warehouse. 2 weeks while he cut us." The supernatural judgment wasn't just showing him their deaths. It was forcing him to experience every moment of agony he could have prevented. Each choice to prioritize long-term operations over immediate rescues, each decision to sacrifice individual children for strategic advantage, magnified into cosmic horror. "No," Miguel gasped, but his protest crumbled under the weight of perfect memory. He had known. DEA surveillance had identified Martinez's torture chambers 3 days before Elena's kidnapping. Miguel had recommended waiting, building a larger case, letting the monster continue his work while they gathered evidence that would never hold up in Colombia's corrupted courts. The Herrera boy's voice joined the supernatural chorus. 7 years Agent Ramirez filed reports. 7 years he chose politics over people. The dead children remember every compromise. Outside, the gunfire intensified. Professional killers were establishing a perimeter, cutting off escape routes. But Miguel barely registered the physical danger. The amulet's revelation was tearing his sanity apart thread by thread. He saw Sofia Restrepo hanging from that bridge, her small body swaying in the wind while Miguel sat in a comfortable DEA office, explaining to his superiors why her father's cartel connections made her an acceptable casualty. "My daughter was 7 years old." The new voice cut through the children's whispers like a blade. Miguel turned to see a man standing in the candlelit doorway, tall, distinguished, wearing an expensive suit that somehow remained immaculate despite the supernatural chaos surrounding them. This was Restrepo, but not the academic who'd recruited him. This was a father whose child had died while Agent Miguel Ramirez weighed political considerations. "Professor Restrepo," Miguel forced out through gritted teeth. "Your daughter, I didn't know. You had intelligence on the Santiago cartel 3 weeks before they took her." Restrepo's voice carried the calm precision of a man who'd spent 7 years planning this moment. "You recommended surveillance instead of intervention, building a case instead of saving a child." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. This wasn't about Pablo Escobar's artifacts. It was an elaborate trap, a supernatural reckoning orchestrated by a grieving father with unlimited resources and an intimate knowledge of Miguel's past sins. The convoy ambush, the mysterious employers, the convenient intelligence about artifact locations, all of it designed to force Agent Miguel Ramirez into direct confrontation with his accumulated guilt. "The other families," Miguel whispered. "The Morales house, the Jade Mask. Actors, hired performers, in a carefully scripted performance designed to prepare you for this moment." Restrepo stepped into the room, his movement causing the silver amulet to pulse brighter. Though the artifacts themselves are quite real, pre-Columbian judgment totems used by shamans to force spiritual accounting upon those who'd forgotten their obligations to the innocent. The gunfire outside grew closer. Miguel realized with growing horror that there was no extraction team coming. The professional killers weren't there to steal artifacts. They were there to ensure Miguel Vargas never left this room alive. But first, he had to experience the full weight of every child's death he'd allowed through strategic inaction. Isabella Herrera stopped rocking, her tear-streaked face turning toward Miguel with supernatural clarity. My son died in a cartel crossfire 18 months ago. But Agent Ramirez's reports could have prevented the territorial war that killed him, if anyone had acted on the intelligence instead of filing it away. Miguel's legs gave out. He collapsed beside the coffee table, still clutching the amulet, his consciousness fragmenting under the pressure of perfect moral clarity. Every rationalization he'd constructed over 7 years of fieldwork crumbled like sand castles before the tide of supernatural judgment. Elena, he whispered, thinking of his living daughter. The photograph pressed against his heart felt like a weight of lead, a reminder of love that might be forever lost to the consequences of his past choices. Your extraction, Restrepo said softly. Your new identity, your family's safety, all contingent on you surviving what comes next. The artifacts aren't just showing you the past, Agent. They're preparing you to face the parents of every child whose death you could have prevented. Through the window, Miguel saw muzzle flashes drawing closer. But the real terror was internal, the growing realization that Miguel Ramirez's sins had finally caught up with him, that some debts could only be paid in blood and suffering. The blessed salt beneath his shirt crumbled to ash. The amulet's judgment burned through his palm like molten silver. Outside, his would-be executioners tightened their noose. And in the candle-lit darkness, the voices of murdered children whispered a single terrible truth. There is no escape from remembrance.